Mountains and the metal element. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. I've been hiking in the mountains in the South Island of New Zealand over the last couple of days, so I thought this would be a good timely time to make a vlog talking about the mountains and how that symbolism, and not just that symbolism, but how some of the aspects of the mountains work within Qigong, Chinese medicine, Chinese philosophy, and some of the things that we can understand from the mountains in relationship to our energy. In Chinese philosophy, one of the frameworks that they use for understanding how different things relate to each other and how they interact is the 5 elements. And these relationships, these patterns in the 5 elements affect every aspect of life. Everything from the elements relate to the organs inside our body, and different organs have a strong relationship with one element or another. It relates to food, the characteristics of food, flavors of food. It relates to the seasons. It relates to personality traits, emotions, and of course to our physical environment as well, where we find different characteristics within different parts of the physical environment, which has a different effect on the energy within that environment. And so in that system of the 5 elements, one of those is the metal element, and the landscape associated with the metal element is the mountains. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those other aspects, things like organs and emotions and things like that, and how that ties in with the landscape of mountains. Because it's really interesting to see how all of these things come together. These things that might seem quite separate in a way have these common threads which tie them all together, and it makes the 5 element system really useful, where you can gain many insights that you can apply to lots of different areas within your life. So first, the organs. The organs associated with the metal element are the lungs and the large intestine. And if you think about the mountains, going up into the mountains makes your lungs work harder. Because, well, one, they work hard just because you're going up and down hills, so that's physically strenuous. But the other thing is, even if you're not going up and down the hills, the higher altitude you go, the air becomes thinner, and your lungs have to work harder. And so it makes sense that there's this association between the lungs, the metal element, and the mountains. The large intestines is another interesting one, maybe not so obvious immediately, but this ties in, there's no way I'm going to be able to cover every detail of these relationships in this little vlog. But it does tie in with the function of the breathing and the lungs. And when we breathe fully, it massages the organs because of the movement internally. And this helps the large intestine to empty out. So that is part of it. And certainly you get lots of physical activity when you're in the mountains, quite naturally. Again, because you're up and down the slopes all the time, just to get anywhere. And so, that contributes to that. But this then also ties in, as I mentioned, particularly with the emotions. So the primary emotion associated with the metal element is referred to as grief often. So grieving. What is grieving, really? Sometimes we think of grieving particularly as sadness. But there's more to it than that, or there's some other aspects to it. And grieving really is the process of letting go of something that sometimes this is done. Well, there's something that's removed from us, and so then we grieve because we have to let it go. Other times it can be a case of consciously choosing to let go of something. And this is one of the characteristics of the metal element as well. Some of those, you could call them personality traits so precision is one of them, but also of refining. And again, this ties in with the idea of metal specifically, because often metal in its basic form, that as it might be dug out from a mine in the mountain. So again, that association with metal, often metals are mined in mountains. In its form that you might initially get it, it's often not very useful. And so it needs to be refined. And in that refining process, the parts that we don't need are cast off, and we just keep the parts that we do need. And so, sometimes life makes this happen to us, right? And other times this can be a conscious choice of refining and letting go of the things that aren't necessary. And again, there's a bit of different context depending on which of those situations it is, whether something's removed from us or whether we're consciously choosing to let something go. But they're very relevant. When you're climbing in the mountains, it's interesting. It becomes, when we're living in other situations, often we have a focus on accumulating more and more, and often of things that we don't really need. When you're climbing in the mountains, because you're having to carry everything that you need, and that includes, clothing, but also food, often water, although hopefully you might have access to get more water, things to keep you warm at night, all of the essential things. It becomes more about how little you can have. And so there's this refining process of getting rid of anything that's not necessary, because you only want to carry what you have to, and you want to carry the things that are most important for keeping you alive, and hopefully for having an enjoyable time as well. I guess going back to that other situation associated with grieving, or grief, that those situations where something maybe, rather than us consciously choosing to let go of it, it's something that's taken from us, and we haven't necessarily had a choice in that. Again, the mountains, there's some valuable aspects to the mountains. One of the things that mountains have been used for historically is often these are considered to be spiritual places. Across multiple different facets that are relevant to this, actually. Often temples and monasteries were built in mountains, and this is because they were places where you could get away from the rest of the world, because it takes a lot of work to go up into the mountains, and so typically it's not a lot of people living up there, and in doing that, gain a clearer perspective. And that's really a big part of how the mountains relate to grieving. When we get right up into the mountains, we can see the rest of the world. Well, if we're able to look through the clouds, we get this much wider perspective of the world below. And so when we're dealing with something and it's up close in our face and personal, it's hard for us to put it into the bigger picture of life sometimes. But by going into the mountains and seeing the broad vista, it becomes easier to put that into perspective and to accept things for what they are, and recognize that each thing is just one part in a greater whole. And this can be really, really useful in terms of processing and letting go of situations that are past, relationships that are past, and whatever it may be. So I'm going to add just one more detail about the metal element and the mountains. Of course, like I said, I can't possibly cover all of those different details and aspects of this, because it really does affect every area of life, and there's so many rich details there. But one more that you might find interesting, and that is to do with the relationship between the metal element and some of the other elements, and how the mountains tie into this as well. It's interesting when people look at the Chinese five element system. They often wonder, because so the five elements in the Chinese system are water, wood, fire, earth, and metal. And it's quite often that people wonder about, and I quite often get people ask me, well, what about air? Shouldn't air be one of the elements? And because it is in some other systems, some other cultures have systems of elements as well, and sometimes air occurs as one of the elements in their systems. But we don't see that in the Chinese system. And here's the little secret. Air has a strong association with the metal element. Now, there's some reasons why it's specifically characterized as metal, and some of the things we've talked about, the process of refining and so on. But you can see very clearly the lungs, one of the primary organs related to the metal element. Well, this is about air, right? When we go up into the mountains, if you think about where do you go for clean, fresh air, you go up into the mountains. And this is where often the air is clear, and so there's this while we're talking about metal, it's also relating to the air. One of the interesting relationships between the five elements, because each of those five elements interact with each other in different ways, and this helps us to tie in and maybe understand also the relationship between air and the metal element, is the relationship between water and metal. So in the generating cycle, there are different cycles of the five elements. In the generating cycle, metal generates water. You think that's a bit odd, metal generating water? Well, there's a few ways that this works. One is in terms of quite simple. Well, actually, it's about condensation, but in different ways. If you think about, if you have a cool, dewy morning, and you put a piece of metal out, outdoors on the grass maybe, as the dew forms, it will form in the metal first before on the rest of the surrounding grass. And that's because of the conductivity of the metal. It causes that condensation to happen there first. And it's similar with the mountains as well. So when we have moist air come in off the ocean, or somewhere else, but we've got this moist air comes in, and then it hits the mountains, and at the mountains it has to rise upwards. This causes condensation. And so typically we get a lot of rain in the mountains, and then the rivers flow down out of the mountains back down into the rest of the environment. And so we have water coming from metal, water coming out of the mountains. And more specifically, so it's coming from the mountain, but also it's coming from the air. It's that warm, moist air hits the mountains, and as the air rises up, the condensation then comes down, and so that water is coming out of the air. So it's really fascinating to explore some of these different manifestations of the energy of nature and how they tie together with the philosophy, the frameworks that have been developed over thousands of years to understand these relationships and to really, really experience the energy of these places as well. So I have been really enjoying my time up here in the mountains, and I'm going to make a couple of other vlogs, I think, as well while I'm up here. So if you've enjoyed this one, maybe you'll enjoy those other ones as well. I look forward to seeing you in one of those other vlogs.